The butter sat on the mercantile counter, a perfect pound wrapped in clean muslin, cool to the touch in the sweltering August air. It was the color of pale gold, of early morning sunlight through a dusty window, and it held its shape with a firm, placid dignity. Around it, the talk of Jericho Springs eddied and swirled. Men who had spent their lives judging livestock by the breadth of a flank or the gallons in a pail leaned in, squinting, as if the butter itself held a secret they had missed. Women, their faces tight with worry over the cost of shipped-in lard, touched the package with a single, reverent finger. It was just butter, and yet it was not. It was the only real butter left in the county, and it came from the one cow everyone had agreed was worth less than the rope used to lead her. It came from Elspeth. 6 months earlier, in the chill of a late February auction, Elspeth stood alone at the back of the crowd. The wind found the thin spots in her coat, a constant reminder of the arithmetic of her life. So much warmth needed, so few dollars to buy it. She was 26, a widow of 2 years, with a deed to 40 acres of scorned land her husband had bought in a fit of optimism before the fever took him. The land was mostly rock and scrub, with a creek that ran thin even in a wet year. The town saw her as a temporary fixture, a sad story that would eventually end with her selling for a pittance and moving on. The auctioneer was working his way through the last of the livestock, the culls and the strays. "All right, folks, what we have here is, well, she's a cow," he said, earning a ripple of laughter. The animal in the ring was a sorry sight. She was a Guernsey, maybe, but of a washed-out, dusty dun color. One of her horns was broken off halfway down, giving her a permanently quizzical look. She was old, her hips sharp beneath her hide, and she stood with a placid indifference that the crowd took for stupidity. "Won my bid for this magnificent specimen." A man called out, $10 for the hide. More laughter. Silas Croft, who owned the largest herd in the valley and the mercantile where all debts were settled, watched with a look of detached amusement. He bought and sold cattle by the dozen, sleek Herefords and heavy-chested Holsteins whose value was measured in clear, unambiguous gallons. This creature was an anomaly, a joke. "I hear 10. Do I hear 15? The auctioneer scanned the crowd. No one moved. The cow blinked her long, dark lashes unconcerned. Elspeth felt a strange pull. She had watched the other animals, the nervous, kicking calves, and the bellowing steers. This one was quiet. She looked at the rocky pasture in her mind's eye, a place no prime animal could tolerate. She saw this cow standing there, perfectly at home. $20, Elspeth said. Her voice was clear but not loud, yet cut through the murmuring. Every head turned. Silas Croft's gaze fell on her, his amusement shifting to something like pity. A woman alone, buying a worthless animal. It was a confirmation of everything they assumed. 20 from a lady in the back. Do I hear 25? Another farmer, emboldened, yelled 30. He was goaded by his friends, a joke bid. Elspeth did her arithmetic. She had $52 to her name, meant to last until spring planting. It was a fool's bet, but her husband had always said the overlooked thing is where you find your start. 40, she said, her voice steady. A hush fell. The joke was over. $40 was real money for an animal destined for the rendering plant. The other bidder shook his head, grinning, and backed down. The auctioneer, surprised, slammed his gavel. Sold, to the lady with more nerve than sense. As Elspeth led the one-horned cow away with a cheap rope halter, she could feel the town's judgment following her like a shadow. Silas Croft tipped his hat as she passed. "A brave purchase, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth with condescension. "If you find you can't manage, you know where to find me. I'd hate to see you struggle." She just nodded, her jaw set, and kept walking the long, dusty road back to the land no one else wanted, with the cow no one else would have. The cow, whom Elspeth decided to call June, settled into the small, sturdy barn as if she had been born there. The 40 acres were just as the town described them, poor. The soil was thin, the grass sparse. But Elspeth walked it every day, not with a farmer's eye for yield, but with an observer's patience. She saw what others had dismissed. The ground was not barren. It was covered in a thick mat of plants the big ranchers called weeds. Deep-rooted chicory with its tough stem and pale blue flower, broadleaf plantain, and patches of a stubborn, sweet-smelling clover that thrived in the rocky soil. Her nearest neighbor was Mrs. Gorski, a woman who had come from the old country with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that had seen more than Jericho Springs could imagine. She appeared at Elspeth's fence line one morning, a small, stooped figure in a black shawl. She didn't offer pity or advice. She just watched June grazing. The cow moved slowly, selectively, ignoring the thin grasses and instead tearing up mouthfuls of the tougher plants. "She is a wise one," Mrs. Gorski said, her voice thick with an accent that smoothed the edges off her words. "She eats the deep medicine, not the quick sugar grass that burns away." Elspeth, who had been fighting a knot of despair in her stomach, felt it loosen. "The town thinks I'm a fool." Mrs. Gorski pointed a crooked finger at the cow. "The town thinks in herds. They want every animal to be the same, to eat the same, to give the same. But the land is not the same everywhere. Some things, they are not for shouting. They are for listening. This one," she nodded at June, "she listens to the ground. You listen to her." It became Elspeth's guiding principle. She did not try to force the land to be something it wasn't. She didn't plow the thin soil for corn that would fail. She spent her days clearing the larger rocks from the small pasture, giving the deep-rooted herbs more room to spread. She hauled water from the creek, her hands growing rough and calloused. And she listened. She learned the cow's rhythms, the quiet contentment in her sighs, the way she sought out the afternoon shade of the one stunted oak on the property. She began the milking. The first few days confirmed the town's verdict. The quantity was laughable. A typical dairy cow gave gallons. June gave quarts, barely enough for a single household. Elspeth felt a familiar, cold dread. The $40 felt like an anchor pulling her down. She had made a terrible, public mistake. She dutifully strained the milk into glass jars and set them in the cool darkness of her small root cellar. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of her failure. She did the arithmetic of her folly in the dark. $40 for 3 quarts of milk a day. She would be ruined by summer. She did not despair, however. She adjusted. She would have milk for herself, at least. That was something. She would find another way. The next morning, she went to the cellar to fetch milk for her coffee. She held the lamp up to the jars and stopped. She had seen cream lines her whole life, a pale band at the top of the milk. But this was different. The cream line on June's milk was a thick, opaque layer of the palest yellow, taking up nearly half the jar. It was dense, heavy, clinging to the glass when she tilted it. It was unlike any cream she had ever seen. This was the secret. The cow didn't make much milk, but what she made was impossibly rich. It was a quiet economy, hidden from the world of gallons and ledgers. Elspeth felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a fierce, protective joy. She kept it to herself, banking the knowledge like a coal under ash, letting it glow in the dark while the world outside remained cold. She found her mother's old butter churn in the barn, a wooden dasher model, scrubbed clean and smelling of cedar. She skimmed the thick cream into it. The work was methodical, rhythmic. The slosh of the cream, the thump of the dasher. It was a sound that connected her to generations of women who had performed this same alchemy. Slowly, the sound changed. The sloshing thickened, grew heavy. She felt the moment the butter came, the sudden separation of fat from liquid. She lifted the lid. Floating in the thin, cloudy buttermilk were clumps of glorious, pale gold butter. She worked it with wooden paddles, pressing out the last of the buttermilk, washing it in cold water from the creek until the water ran clear. She added a pinch of salt. The finished product was firm and sweet-smelling. It was more than just butter. It was a concentration of a place, of the deep-rooted herbs and the stubborn land and the quiet, one-horned cow. She did the arithmetic again, but this time it was the arithmetic of hope. The small amount of milk had yielded a shocking quantity of butter. 1 quart of June's milk produced what a gallon of ordinary milk might. Suddenly, her $40 risk didn't seem so foolish. Her path forward was not in selling milk by the pail, but butter by the pound. She wrapped a small block in wax paper and sat at her small kitchen table. She spread a thick layer on a piece of stale bread. The flavor was astonishing, nutty, complex, with a hint of something wild and sweet, like wildflowers. It was the taste of a land nobody wanted. It was the taste of survival. Her first challenge was money. Hope didn't pay for lamp oil or salt. She needed to turn the butter into coin, but the thought of facing the town, of taking her product to Silas Croft's mercantile, filled her with a familiar dread. The memory of their laughter was still sharp, so she started smaller. She would make only what she could carry, and she would find a different kind of customer. A boy started appearing at the edge of her property. His name was Leo, a thin, quiet child of about 10, with watchful eyes and clothes that were clean but patched. He was one of those town kids who existed at the margins, never quite part of the loud, boisterous groups. He didn't come amok. He came to watch the cow. He would sit on the stone fence for an hour at a time, silent, just observing June as she grazed. One afternoon, Elspeth was weeding the small garden she'd managed to coax from the better soil near the house. Leo was there, on his usual perch. "She has a name," Elspeth said, not looking up from her work. The boy startled. "Mung." "The cow. Her name is June." Leo considered this. "She looks like a June," he said softly. "She's calm." Elspeth finally looked at him. She saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. On an impulse, she wiped her hands on her apron. "Are you hungry?" He just shrugged, but his eyes fixed on the house. She went inside and came back with 2 thick slices of bread, each slathered with her new butter. She handed one to him. He took it with a hesitant reverence. He sniffed at first, then took a small bite. His eyes went wide. He didn't say a word, just took another, bigger bite, chewing slowly, as if trying to memorize the taste. It was the first time anyone besides herself had tasted it. His silent, profound appreciation was more validating than a sack of gold coins. He started coming by every day after that. He never asked for much, but he found ways to make himself useful. He would haul buckets of water from the creek, his thin arms straining. He would help her muck out the small barn. He called the cow Junebug because, he explained, for such a big animal, she moved with a surprising gentleness, never stepping on a stray chick or knocking over a pail. In return for his help, Elspeth always had a piece of bread and butter for him, and sometimes a glass of the fresh, rich buttermilk. A silent, unspoken partnership formed between the woman, the boy, and the cow, an odd little family on the forgotten edge of town. He was her first believer. It was Leo who gave her the courage to take the next step. "This is better than the store-bought butter," he said one day, his mouth full. "It's better than anything." She knew she couldn't hide forever. The $52 had dwindled to 10. She wrapped 5 one-pound blocks in clean muslin, then in wax paper, tying each with twine. She walked into Jericho Springs, her basket heavy with her hopes. She bypassed the imposing facade of Croft's Mercantile, with its barrels of flour and bolts of cloth, the hub of the town's economy and its judgment. Her destination was smaller, humbler. Henderson's Bakery, a narrow building at the end of the street that always smelled of yeast and cinnamon. Mr. Henderson was a baker, which meant he was a pragmatist. His world revolved around tangible things: the heft of flour, the heat of the oven, the precise chemical reaction of yeast. He was a stern, flour-dusted man with forearms like logs, and he did not suffer fools. When Elspeth entered, he gave her a cursory glance. "I have butter to sell," she said, her voice betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. He grunted, not looking up from the dough he was kneading. "Got a supplier, miss. From Croft's Dairy." "Good enough. I think mine is better," she said simply. That made him stop. He wiped his hands on his apron and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He knew who she was. Everyone knew about the woman with the Joe cow. "That's so? From that one-horn charity case you bought? What's it make a cup a day?" Elspeth didn't flinch. She met his skeptical gaze and unwrapped one of the pounds of butter. The pale gold block sat on the counter, cool and perfect. She hadn't brought a cracker, but Mr. Henderson, without a word, broke off a piece of a fresh, warm loaf. He scraped a small amount of butter onto it, and popped it into his mouth. The change was immediate and profound. It was not a dramatic gasp, but something quieter, more significant. The hard, cynical lines of his face softened. He closed his eyes for a moment, chewing slowly, his entire being focused on the sensation on his tongue. He was a man who understood ingredients, and in that bite he tasted not just fat and salt, but a quality he hadn't experienced in years. He tasted the difference between commerce and craft. He opened his eyes and looked at the butter, then at her. He saw her not as the town's fool, but as a producer of something extraordinary. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough but stripped of its earlier scorn. 50 cents a pound, she said. It was a high price, a risk. He didn't haggle. "I'll take all 5. And I'll take 5 more on Saturday. Keep this quality up, and I'll buy every pound you can make." Elspeth walked out of the bakery and into the sunlight, her basket empty and her pocket holding $2.50. It felt heavier than any money she had ever earned. It was not just coin, it was proof. Being right was its own kind of reply. The arrangement with Mr. Henderson gave Elspeth a foundation. The steady income was small, but it was enough. It bought flour and salt, a new pair of boots for Leo, and seed for her garden. It silenced the gnawing anxiety of the arithmetic of survival. More importantly, it created a quiet ripple. Henderson's bread and pastries, already the best in town, took on a new richness. People noticed. They would bite into a biscuit and pause, asking, "Henderson, what's different?" "This is the best I've ever had." He would just smile. Good ingredients. The secret of Elspeth's butter began to spread, not as a shout, but as a whisper. It became a thing of value, first among a few, then a wider circle. The women who bought Henderson's bread began to talk. The butter from the strange cow on the poor land was, impossibly, the finest they had ever tasted. The narrative of Elspeth's folly began to fray at the edges. Silas Croft heard the whispers. He was a man who dealt in volume, in quantity, and the idea that a single, worthless cow could produce anything of note was an affront to his entire worldview. Value, to him, was a number in a ledger, the sum of a herd, the weight of a grain shipment. He couldn't reconcile the town's growing murmurings with the pathetic animal he'd seen at the auction. He saw Elspeth in town one supply day. She was no longer the haunted, solitary figure from the auction. There was a new stillness about her, a quiet confidence in the way she stood. She was talking to Leo, who was helping her load a sack of flour into her small cart. Croft approached them, his smile as smooth and false as a counterfeit coin. "Miss Elspeth," he began, tipping his hat. "Good to see you looking so well. That little farm of yours must be agreeing with you." "It is, Mr. Croft," she replied, her tone even. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial, benevolent tone. "I've been thinking about you out there, a young woman alone. It's a hard life. I feel partly responsible, letting you buy that animal. Tell you what, I'll take her off your hands. I'll give you $60 for her, a $20 profit for your trouble. It'd be a kindness, really, get you a bit of cash to see you through till you sell the place." He expected gratitude, perhaps a tearful acceptance of his generous offer to rescue her from her own foolishness. He did not expect her calm, level gaze. "She's not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile tightened. The refusal puzzled and annoyed him. He couldn't comprehend it. It was bad business. "Ma'am, be sensible. She's a cull cow. What possible value could she have to you?" "She has her value," Elspeth said, turning back to her cart. The conversation was over. Croft was left standing there, a flicker of real anger in his eyes. It wasn't about the cow, not really. It was about the disruption of the known order. He was the one who determined value in Jericho Springs. For this woman, this nobody with her patch of weeds and her joke of a cow, to possess something valuable that he couldn't measure or control was an insult. He watched her walk away, and for the first time, he saw her not as an object of pity, but as a problem. The seasons turned. Spring's tender green gave way to the deep, heavy foliage of early summer. And then the rain stopped. At first, its absence was a relief, a string of perfect, sun-drenched days. But the days stretched into a week, then two. The sky remained a hard, brilliant, merciless blue. The dust on the road puffed up in thicker clouds. The creek on Elspeth's property, always modest, shrank until it was just a dark, damp ribbon of mud with a few isolated pools. Mrs. Gorski would stand at her fence line in the evenings, her face turned to the west, sniffing the air. No rain in it, she would say, her voice grim. The sky is too clean. By July, the word drought was on everyone's lips. It was a hot, dry rasp of a word. The lush, green pastures of the valley, the pride of ranchers like Silas Croft, began to scorch. The quick-growing grasses that fattened their herds turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle, lifeless brown. The earth cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. The big herds began to suffer. The cows grew thin, their ribs showing. Their milk production, the lifeblood of the valley's economy, slowed to a trickle. The milk that was produced was thin and bluish, lacking richness. Panic began to set in, a low hum of anxiety beneath the town's daily business. Silas Croft, his face a permanent scowl, was forced to spend a fortune having feed shipped in by rail, but it wasn't the same. His prize Holsteins, bred for abundant grass and water, languished in the oppressive heat. But on Elspeth's 40 acres, a small miracle was taking place. The weeds that June favored, the chicory and plantain and deep-rooted clover, were built for hardship. Their roots reached far down into the earth, drawing on moisture the shallow-rooted pasture grasses could no longer find. While the rest of the valley burned, Elspeth's small pasture remained a patchwork of stubborn, dusty green. June was untroubled. She browsed contentedly on the tough, resilient plants, sought her shade under the oak, and drank from the deepest pool that remained in the creek bed. And her milk, to Elspeth's profound relief, remained the same. The volume did not drop. The cream line was just as thick, just as yellow. The drought that was devastating the valley's conventional wisdom was proving the truth of Mrs. Gorski's. The land knew what was needed. June, by listening to the land, was thriving. The contrast was so stark it felt like a judgment. Elspeth's one scorned cow, on the land no one wanted, was weathering the crisis better than Silas Croft's entire prize-winning herd. By August, the drought was no longer a crisis. It was a catastrophe. The creek beds were bone-dry. The sound of lowing, hungry cattle was a constant, mournful backdrop to the shimmering heat. In town, the consequences were plain. Croft's Mercantile had little local produce to sell. The price of shipped-in feed and flour was ruinous. The quality of what little dairy was available had collapsed entirely. The local butter was greasy and pale, with a sour, desperate taste. Except for one. Elspeth's butter, once a whispered secret, was now a legend. Henderson's bakery was an oasis. He had a secure supply of the only good butter left, and his products were a source of comfort in a town gripped by fear. Demand for the butter itself exploded. The whispers became outright pleas. People who had laughed at the auction now appeared at Elspeth's gate, their faces etched with a mixture of embarrassment and desperate need. Mrs. Gable, from 2 farms over, came first. Her husband had been one of the loudest scoffers. "Miss Elspeth," she began, twisting her apron in her hands, I hear you have butter for sale." Elspeth looked at the woman's tired, worried face. She could have named any price. She could have gouged her, taken revenge for the months of mockery. The temptation was there, a bitter little seed. But then she looked past the woman toward the brown, dead fields of the valley, and she thought of the quiet dignity of her cow. Greed was a kind of panic. She had come this far through patience. "The price is 50 cents a pound," she said, her voice steady. "Same as it is for Mr. Henderson." The woman's relief was so profound it was almost painful to watch. "Oh, thank you, miss. Bless you." Word of her fairness spread faster than fire. She was not exploiting their misfortune. She was simply providing. A line began to form at her gate in the mornings, a queue of her former mockers, now waiting patiently, respectfully, for their pound of pale gold butter. She and Leo worked from before dawn until after dusk, churning, paddling, wrapping. Leo, once the marginal town boy, was now a figure of importance, gravely counting out change and handing over the precious parcels. Elspeth's quiet vindication was not in their shame, but in their need, and in her ability to meet it with a steady, generous hand. The arithmetic had changed. She was no longer counting her own survival, but the sustenance of a community. Silas Croft watched the daily pilgrimage to Elspeth's farm with a fury that was eating him alive. It was an intolerable, public humiliation. His herd was failing. His reputation as the valley's preeminent cattleman was in tatters, and the woman he had pitted was now the most vital producer in the county. His entire sense of order had been overturned by a single, one-horned cow and a stubborn woman. He decided to crush her. He rode out to her farm one afternoon, his face a mask of cold rage. He found her by the barn, washing the churn. Leo stood nearby, a silent, protective shadow. "This has gone on long enough," Croft said, dismounting. His voice was hard, stripped of all its previous false warmth. "You're creating a public nuisance. People lining up on the road. And that pasture of yours, it's a disgrace. Full of noxious weeds. I have half a mind to report you to the county council." Elspeth slowly dried her hands on her apron. "My weeds seem to be feeding the town just fine, Mr. Croft." "Don't be clever with me," he snarled. "I'm making you a final offer. I'll buy this whole pathetic scrap of land, cow and all. $500. That's more than it'll ever be worth. You take the money and you leave Jericho Springs. It's for the best. Someone alone could never manage a real business." "I'm managing," she said. "And I'm not alone." She glanced at Leo, who stood a little taller. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "With a boy? That's your plan?" His desperation was making him reckless. "You're a fool. You probably don't even know how much butter you're making. I bet you can't even keep count." He paused, a sly look entering his eyes. "How did you manage to put aside those 30 pounds for the shipment to the city?" A dead silence fell. Elspeth's face remained perfectly still, but her eyes sharpened. Leo looked from Croft to Elspeth, confused. A shipment to the city? They had never made a shipment to the city. They could barely keep up with the town's demand. It was a slip, born of pure, greedy assumption. Croft, unable to imagine success on such a small scale, had invented a narrative of a larger operation, a secret hoard he could seize. In his mind, she had to be cheating somehow, producing more than was possible, hiding her profits. "What 30 pounds? Elspeth asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Croft realized his mistake. He saw it in her eyes. He had revealed his hand, the depth of his envy, and his utter disconnect from the reality of her small, honest enterprise. He had been so consumed with the idea of her hidden wealth that he'd invented it himself. Just then, another figure appeared, walking slowly up the dusty track from the road. It was Mr. Gable, the proud farmer whose wife had been her first desperate customer. He held his hat in his hands, his face a study in humiliation and need. His own prize cows were dry. His children were hungry. He stopped before Elspeth, unable to meet her eyes. "Miss Elspeth," he stammered, his voice thick with shame. I need to ask. I know the price is fair, but I'm wiped out. I can't pay. I just need 1 pound for my family. I'll work it off. I'll mend your fences, I'll." Here was the true test. In front of her antagonist, in front of the town's silent witness, was a man who represented all the scorn she had endured. She held all the power. She could have enjoyed his humiliation, demanded payment, and been entirely within her rights. Instead, she turned away from Croft, her back to his sputtering rage, and walked into the cool of the cellar. She came back with 2 one-pound blocks of butter. She pressed them into Mr. Gable's hands. "There is no debt," she said, her voice clear enough for Croft and God and everyone to hear. "Neighbors help neighbors. Go feed your children." Mr. Gable looked at the butter, then at her, his eyes filling with tears. He could only nod, his gratitude too profound for words. He turned and walked away, a man who had been offered grace when he expected judgment. The act was a quiet thunderclap. It exposed Croft's greed for the hollow, selfish thing it was, and cemented Elspeth's victory not as one of profit, but of character. Silas Croft mounted his horse, his face ashen, and rode away without another word, defeated not by a clever retort, but by a simple, profound act of generosity. The rains returned in September, a soft, steady soaking that smelled of life and forgiveness. The valley slowly began to heal, the brown hills blushing with a faint, hopeful green. The drought was over, but the memory of it and the lessons it had taught remained. Jericho Springs was a changed town. Elspeth's farm was no longer the town joke. It was a landmark. Her butter was no longer a curiosity, but the standard by which all others were judged. When the other farms recovered, their butter never tasted quite the same to the people who had lined up at her gate. They had tasted the difference, and they remembered. She never had to seek customers again. They sought her. She did not expand in the way Silas Croft would have. She never bought a huge herd or 100 acres. She bought 2 more cows, both of them culls, both of them placid observers who knew how to listen to the land. She and Leo ran the small dairy together, a model of quiet, sustainable prosperity. Leo, who had started as a silent boy on a fence rail, was now a young man who understood the alchemy of cream and the arithmetic of kindness. He was her partner, her apprentice, and her family. Silas Croft's power in the valley was diminished. His humiliation had been too public. He had been shown to be a man who, in a crisis, would hoard and threaten while a woman he'd scorned chose to share and sustain. His ledgers were still full, but his authority had been hollowed out. A thing is only worth what others believe it is, and the town no longer believed in his brand of value. One cool autumn evening, Elspeth stood with Mrs. Gorski at the fence line, watching June and the other 2 cows graze in the dusk. The air was rich with the smell of damp earth and curing herbs. "The land is happy," Mrs. Gorski observed. Elspeth nodded, her hands resting on the worn wood of the fence. She thought of the journey from the auction, the weight of the town's scorn, the quiet joy of that first perfect churn, the fear of the drought, and the final, sweet vindication. She had been right to listen. "Some things are not for shouting," Mrs. Gorski said, repeating the wisdom she had offered months before. "They are for listening." The land knew what was needed. Elspeth agreed, her voice full of a calm, earned certainty. She went inside as the last light faded, leaving the women to their conversation. In the warm lamplight of her kitchen, she began to work the churn. The rhythmic, steady thump of the dasher was no longer a sound of desperate labor, but a song of abundance. It was the sound of a promise kept, the heartbeat of a life built not on what the world valued, but on the hidden, resilient worth of the thing that had been rejected. The pale gold butter she lifted from the churn was more than food. It was proof that the deepest value often lies in the overlooked, and that the greatest strength is found in the patience to listen to the quiet truths the world has forgotten how to hear.